Hello everybody, look at all these bottom brackets we got here. We got all kinds of them, from threaded to PF30 to BB30 to adapters. Here's another adapter. There's just a lot of them, and people have a lot of questions about this, and it's really confusing because they keep making new ones. Basically, my name is John. I'm just going to cover all this, dimensions, compatibility, conversions, and a little bit more. Basically, I'm going to talk about chapter 1. I'm going to start with the general overview of all the different kinds, you know, the anatomy of a bottom bracket, what is a bottom bracket, defined terms, that sort of thing. And then I'll go through the evolution of cranks, that's chapter 2. And then I'll take an in-depth look of bottom brackets of threaded kinds first. That'll be chapter 3. And then I'm going to do the non-threaded varieties like this. That'll be chapter 4. And then we'll talk about compatibility, identifying what you have, the conversions, which are possible, which are not. I might miss some, but you know, this isn't, I can't possibly tell you everything, so you have to figure some things out for yourself. So with that, let's get started. Okay, let's talk about a few terms. When I speak of bottom bracket, I am referring to one of these. Bottom brackets have bearings in them. That allows your crank to rotate. And then we have the bottom bracket shell, which I have this carbon 9er frame. This one happens to be a PF30, 73 millimeters wide. It has no threads in it. That's a shell. That's part of your frame, all right? And then, obviously, this is a crank. That's what a crank is. Duh. Here's another shell. This one happens to be a threaded version, right there. Road one. Okay. Those are the terms. All right. So we have external types. When I say external, it refers to this kind. When I say it's a threaded, it's got a spindle type. That's this. When I say threadless, it has no threads on it. It pushes in. Okay. All right. So that's chapter 1. Okay, chapter 2 is going to be the evolution of cranksets. All right. So for a very long time, we had this style. This is a square taper. All right. It matches up with this kind of a bottom bracket. This is probably the most common bottom bracket on planet Earth right now. It's used on cheap bikes. It was used on very expensive bikes like this carbon chorus crank for a very long time. There's nothing wrong with it. It's been around a long time. All right, so then they started coming up with different spline patterns, all right? They had square taper and they had octalink right here. It corresponds with this one right here. And then they started messing around with splines. Each company had to come up with something different. So Shimano came up with this one here, is octalink. This is a cheaper SRAM Truvative power spline. This one's ISIS, all right? There might be more out there, but those are the big deals. And then eventually they started to see how all these have spindles in them, all right? Eventually they started putting the spindle on the crank itself, all right? That made this part lighter. It eliminated any sort of guesswork on how long this needed to be, with how long a spindle you needed. It was a pretty good upgrade, and that's my favorite kind of style of bottom bracket. I don't really like those. All right, that is sort of, oh, forgot this. All right, so they eventually put the spindle on this. This is 24 millimeters. If I were to measure this right here, it'd be 24 millimeters. And then, you know, they got sick of that, so let's make it 30 millimeters, all right? This is a 30 millimeter. It happens to be a BB30 crankset here. So they went from this, all right, from going from 24 millimeters, this is 24 millimeters, it has to match, to big stuff like this. And obviously you can't get a spindle that's 30 millimeters into this and then not have enough room. So they had to redo the bottom bracket shell design like that PF30 I just showed you on that 9er frame. So that is the basic evolution of cranksets. We went from spindles to not having a spindle at all, having it part of the crankset, to making it bigger, different spline patterns. All right, that's the evolution. Okay, chapter 3, threaded bottom brackets. We're going to break this into two groups, okay? We have the original group, group A. I'm going to call these spindled. That means the spindle is part of the bottom bracket, all right? And then we have group B, external, right here, where the bearings sit outside the frame. That's why it's called external, okay? So we're going to talk about square taper. This is one of them. This is what square taper looks like. It comes in various lengths like that. All right. And we have an octalink right here. This is version 2. The splines are longer in version 2. If you had a version 1, the spline would be shorter, and you can't mix them up. So if you have a version 1 crankset, you need a version 1 bottom bracket. If you have version 2 bottom bracket, you need a version 2 crank. Can't mix them up. All right, and then we have power spline, sort of a cheap, you find these on cheaper bikes. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, just cheap. And then this was kind of like the heyday here of the spline. These are pretty heavy duty. They work pretty well like that. That one is an ISIS, all right? All right, that was all these here. And then we're gonna get into group B, where they made the spindle part of the crankset. Shimano has road and mountain versions. This one happens to be a road. All right, it's only for 68 millimeter bikes. All right, this one happens to be a mountain bike. We have spacers in here. Mountain bikes can be either 68 or 73, so they just made their cranksets compatible with 73. And if you had a 60 millimeter frame, they put these little spacers in. You put those in. Well, you have a 73 millimeter bottom bracket now. All of a sudden. This is a GXP. It looks like a road one to me, but GXP is 24 millimeters, same as all the other ones, except for the other side has a step down. So if you have a GXP crankset, you have to use GXP bottom bracket external. All right, and FSA's version is called the Mega EXO. They make road and mountain versions of this. All sort of works the same principle. They use a tool to thread on. It's got threads. All right, and then we have Campies. It's not on my sheet, but this is called Ultra Torque, I believe, because there's no bearings in it. If you had a power torque, you'd have a bearing in one of these cups, but it's threaded, same cups on the outside, external. All right, and then we're going to get into widths here. The width of your shell. Pretend this has got threads in it. This happens to be an adapter, but pretend this is your bottom bracket shell on your frame, right? This is 68 millimeters wide, all right? When I say this is how wide it is, that's how wide it is, all right? They make road and mountain in 68 and 73. They make a 70 millimeter Italian. They make 83 millimeter wide ones, and then they make 100 millimeter wide ones. So these are the most common right here. The other ones, if you had one, you probably would know, all right? So that's chapter 3, threaded bottom brackets. Okay, now we're gonna get into the threadless versions. So they have a big 30 millimeter spindle, usually, not always, but 30 millimeters, all right? This is a BB30/PF30. We're just doing BB30, PF30 right now. All right, so BB30 and PF30 cranksets are identical. The only difference is they use a different bottom bracket, okay? So the bearings go into your frame and you can't see them from the outside, so their bearings are internal, all right? They are pressed in. The arm has a spindle on it like the Mega EXO, Holotech 2 external type bottom brackets, except now they're 30 millimeters. Smooth, there's no threads on the inside of the shell like that frame I showed you a little bit ago. BB30 and PF30, 68 millimeters is road only, 73 millimeters is mountain bike, all right? You might find some mountain bike cranks that are capable of being put on a 68 millimeter frame, but technically this is sort of the rule. BB30s, the inside of the frame looks like this, except on a BB30 frame, you're going to have little rings on the inside. It's going to be a little narrower. It's going to be 42 millimeters. And these little clips would go in and then lock in place, like that, inside your frame. And then the bearing itself would go in, press in, and those little clips would keep it from falling into the frame when you're pedaling. All right? So the inner diameter of a BB30 shell will be 42 millimeters. This bearing, if you measure the outside diameter, would be 42 millimeters, right around there. And the inside diameter of this bearing would be about 30 millimeters, hence BB30. All right, and this is BB30, so the bottom bracket looks like this. It's gonna have a few more parts, but this is basically what it looks like, all right? Two bearings, little clips to hold it in place, maybe some little things that go on the outside to make it look better than it does. All right, so that was BB30. So now I gotta find my PF30 bottom bracket, which is right here. They have an inside diameter of 46 millimeters. All right, the frame has to be 46 millimeters for you to slip this in. It doesn't work in a BB30 frame, it only works in a PF30 frame. So what they just did, they just made press-in cups, bearings going like that, you know, pretty simple, slides in, expands out to fit 73 millimeters, all that fun stuff. All right, so let's go over my little things. There are no snap rings on these, on the PF30. Bearings are held in a plastic press fit unit. All right. So the next threadless variety, BB86/92. This, or BB86/92, this is for 24 millimeter bottom brackets, or cranksets. This will not work with the BB30 frame, or crankset. It won't go in a BB30 frame either. This is specially for press fit bottom brackets, all right, frame, bottom bracket shells, all right? They work in conjunction with the old style external crankset. As you might notice, I have one here. It is the same width, about, this is a mountain one, this is a road, this is a mountain, as this would be if it was actually in a frame. So that's how they were able to use this, which was ordinarily intended for this, with this, all right? The bearings will be inside the frame with one of these. All right, so let's go over my little notes here. Intended for 24 millimeter spindle cranksets, pressed in smoothbore shell. Inner diameter will be 41 millimeters right here of the shell on your frame, and this will be 41 millimeters, all right? Width would be 86.5 millimeters for road on your shell on your frame. That's how wide it will be. 91.5 for mountain bike, like this one is. All right. Overall width the same as externals. Bottom brackets, no snap rings, similar to PF30. So they are very similar, right? It's just, this is the version for the old style crankset, so you can use them. All right. BB90/95 is used exclusively on Trek. They use a smaller bearing than this, but it's the same kind. It's essentially BB30 adapted to be used with this kind of crankset. It's going to have snap rings, that sort of thing. Used exclusively on Trek bikes, similar to BB30. Internal, or intended for use with 24 millimeter spindle cranksets. Internal bearings, use snap rings. The bearing, or the frame itself, the shell, will have an inner diameter of 37 millimeters. And the width would be 90.5 on your frame for a road bike, 95.5 for a mountain bike. Okay. All right, that's that part. I'm gonna stop the camera for a little bit and we'll talk about more threadless versions. All right, let's talk about B-Bright direct fit and press fit. Okay. B-Bright is essentially the same as a BB30, right? Except they wanted to make the shell wider to accommodate, I don't know, maybe it makes it stiffer, I don't know, I don't really care. But they just made the spindle longer, so you needed a longer spindle, but longer bottom bracket shell. And then they just made it PF30 versions and BB30 versions of it, except for it's called BB30 would be called the direct fit Be Bright. The PF30 version of it would be called the press fit Be Bright. All right. It's currently used on Cervelo bikes, road only. Same features as BB30/PF30, except the shell will be 79 millimeters wide. Crank spindle is longer. Direct fit is the 79 millimeter equivalent of BB30. 42 millimeter inner diameter of a Be Bright. So same as BB30, except for this number here is bigger rather than 68. Press fit is the PF30 version, 79 millimeters wide. It'll be 46 millimeters inner diameter of a Be Bright press fit. All right. And then somebody else had to make a different version. It's kind of the cousin to the Be Bright, except it currently only has a press fit cup. The shell outside will be 86.5 millimeters wide. It's road only, just like this one. 46 millimeter diameter. So the difference between a Be Bright and a 386 Evo is that the shell is wider on the 386 Evo versus the Be Bright. So for Cervelo. Okay, and that is all of the versions. You've seen them all now. And then I'm going to go through a little section on identifying what you have, so that if you buy something else, you know, whoa, what do I have? You don't know, so you don't have to call me and bug me about it. So, all right, that's the next chapter, chapter 4, I believe. All right, identifying what you have. All right, this can be difficult because some people don't want to take their bike apart to figure out what they have. It's actually not that difficult. Removing this style of arm, I can get this cranks in and out of a bike in like 5 minutes max. So the best way is to take your bike apart. Thread versions. All right, the presence of bolts on the arms mean you have a threaded bottom bracket shell, because the spindle is part of the bottom bracket. So the left arm would go on, held on with a bolt. Right arm would go on, held on with a bolt. And you notice that might be different because ones that have the spindle, there's no bolt on the drive arm. There's only one on the other side. So these are the only styles where the bottom bracket has a spindle where you'll have a bolt on either side. So that's one sure way to know that you have an English threaded shell, or not an English threaded, but you have a threaded shell. All right, because it's the old style. All right, you can remove the spindle or the bolt, and you can look and see what kind of spline you have. If you have a square taper like this one, or power spline, or ISIS, or Octolink. You can take the bolt out, but even without removing the arm, you can see what you have. All right, you can measure the width of your shell. That's important, so you buy the right thing the next time. Or if you can see external cups, that means you have a threaded bottom bracket shell as well. So external cups mean you have a threaded bottom bracket shell. If you have one bolt and you see this, that means you have an external bottom bracket shell. All right. These cups are kind of cool because you can see it. It's definitely different than your frame. You can easily tell that it's not part of the frame. It's got little tools that go on like this. That means you have a English threaded shell, or not English, but you have a threaded shell. If you can see little splines in there like this that a tool like this would go into, you have a threaded shell. All right. Okay, identifying what you have. Threadless versions. This means the BB30, PF30, Be Bright, 386 Evo, BB86/92, all that stuff. Okay, measure the shell width compared to specs. Let's say your shell is 79.5 millimeters wide. You know you have a Be Bright. All right. All right. You can remove the arms to access. You can take it off to look at the bearings. If it looks like this, you know you have, and it's got a 24 millimeter inner. You know what kind you have. Okay. Remove the arms to figure out if you have a plastic sleeve like these two. you know you have a press fit kind. That'll be one of the versions I talked about before, PF30, BB86/92, or 386 EVO. You can take a look at these specs here. I'll leave it up on the screen for a little bit, or you can read it. No plastic sleeve. That means you will have this kind. It might be covered up by something, but if you can't see the sleeve, that means you have a BB30 or a BB90/95, B-Bright direct fit 79mm shell. If you can only see bearings and they're all internal, it means you have this kind. Plastic shell, this kind. Compatibility, all right. Rule number 1, start with the frame's bottom bracket shell. This will dictate what kind of bottom bracket is allowable. If you have threads in your frame, you can only use threaded stuff, okay? Rule number 2, bottom bracket will dictate which type of crank is allowed. If I have this, I can't use it with this because this is square taper, it wouldn't work. So this dictates, frame dictates what this you can use, this dictates what this can use, all right? If you had a threaded shell, only threaded shells or threaded bottom brackets can be used, okay? And rule number 4, bottom brackets must match crank, all right? That part. Threaded compatibility, there might be some exceptions, but sort of the overall thing. Shell width must be compatible with your bottom bracket. You can upgrade to another style of crankset in a threaded bottom bracket if you change it, the bottom bracket. So let's say you had an old square taper like this, all right? You can't very well use it with this. So, oh, I got a new crankset. You have to replace the old one right here. Put this one in and it'll work. Well, not this one exactly, but you get the point. All right, so, okay. It's hard reading upside down. 68mm shell, mountain bike external are compatible with 68/73s. That is because they give these little spacers, all right? If you have a square taper or spline/square taper crankset, the spindle comes in different lengths, so that's important. These come in different lengths. See how this one's, oh, it's kind of hard to tell from this angle, but they come in different lengths. This is important to match. This one happens to be a 123mm wide version that if you took calipers out between these 2 points, it would measure 123mm wide. And this one happens to be a 118. You don't have to take it out of the frame to measure it. Just to get a caliper out, you gotta take the crank arms off though, and then measure how wide it is. And then if you want to replace it, get the same length, assuming you're not changing anything else. If you're replacing the crank, you may have to get a different length. If it's too close to the frame, they don't make these standard. So they could slide on a different amount, and this could hit the frame, or maybe it's out too far that your derailleur can't travel that far, so you have to get a shorter one to move this in. And there's really no way to do this to know beforehand what size you're going to need until you try it, and then you say, oh, well, this is in too far, I need to push it out 5mm, so you multiply that by 2 for the other side, and you say, let's say this is 113, and it doesn't work, and I need to push it out 5mm, I need a 123, right? All right, threadless compatibility. BB86 and BB95 shells, this must be used with the 24mm crankset. They are, because it's 41mm, it won't fit these big ones, so you have to use that style. And this is smaller, so obviously couldn't stick a 30mm spindle into a 24mm hole. All right, that's point number 1. BB30/PF30 cranksets are identical to each other. They can work with either bottom bracket. You just have to match your frame. Rule number 1 before. You can't use a BB30 type bottom bracket on PF30 frames or vice versa. All right, so, and we see, if you have a B-Bright 386 Evo, then you're only allowed to use those in that kind of a frame, all right? They're frame specific. They don't work with 68/73 millimeter shells because they're too wide. B-Bright is 79.5 in road, and the other one I forgot was 86.5, I think. There may be some exceptions if you can find adapters. All right, so that's that part. Now we'll talk about conversions. You gotta kind of use your common sense, but you can't use a 30 millimeter spindled crankset in a tiny little shell like this. This is, I don't know, I forgot what the inner diameter of this is. Let me get a caliper. I don't have one, but it's too big, and then there's nothing left to run a bearing in, so that won't work. And because the bearings are all internal on a BB30 crank, the spindle is actually shorter because they don't have anything else sticking out to accommodate for. So if you put the BB30 crank in here, there won't be enough left on this side to screw the left arm on. It won't work. So you can't use BB30 cranks in threaded frames. Big time. You can't do it. All right. You can use threaded type cranksets with certain threadless shells if you find an adapter bottom bracket. Okay. This happens to be a BB30 to 68 millimeter English thread adapter right here. This is a Campy, I believe, Power Torque cup. This fits into a BB30 frame, and then you can run your 24 millimeter spindle. I don't know if they are 24 or Campy, but you can run a threaded version crankset in a BB30 frame using this adapter cup. All right. And this one happens to be an FSA one, where it presses into a BB30 frame, and then you can use their Mega XL cranksets in that frame, right? It is possible to go from, because the crank spindle is smaller on the older styles, it allows you can use them in BB30 frames in the bigger diameter holes, but you just have to reduce the diameter of the bearings and all that fun stuff. Okay, and rule number 3, use your mind to figure out what's possible for conversions. What is and what isn't possible. This won't work in the BB30 frame. Just think of all the possibilities. What can happen? What can't happen? In your mind, is the spindle too long? All that fun stuff, all right? And we're getting to the end, all right? That is the end, all right? I'm sorry, I'm probably had a little jumbled thoughts, but there's a lot to cover. I only want to do this in one take. So I hope it was informative. There's a lot of different kinds. I think from all the things I showed you, you can figure out your own situation. There's some specifics that you can investigate yourself. But for that, I'm out. My name is John.